Hello YouTubers out there, this is Jerry Saravia the Movies. So, today I'm going to talk about something that was brought up by the film director James Gunn. So it was brought up about a week and a half ago. And he said on Twitter, a perfect film can be different from a favorite film or a great film. A perfect film is something that sings from start to finish with no obvious, whether they be aesthetic or structural. There are no logical lapses. Now, he pointed out that Back to the Future seemingly could be imperfect, and he says, why don't Mom and Dad remember Marty? And he says, well, but at the same time, the reason could be that time protects itself from unraveling. Now, Chris Pratt, the actor, defended it and said it's not a plot hole, as some people seem to think, and it isn't a plot hole in Back to the Future. The reason is because Back to the Future, which, you know, nobody should really take too seriously, but in terms of time travel, it's fun to talk about the paradoxes or seeming paradoxes, particularly the second film, which is full of paradoxes. I mean, that film could have its obvious problems. It's not, you know, nearly the film that the original is, but it's a fascinating movie, but it's way overdone in terms of paradox. In fact, the original title for Back to the Future Part 2 was Paradox. Now, Back to the Future, so Marty McFly has his parents, George and Lorraine McFly. Now, if you remember, in the opening scenes of Back to the Future, George McFly works for an auto mechanic or auto detailer in an auto shop for Biff. So Biff is his boss. And he looks nerdy, and he's got the glasses and the pen pocket and all that stuff. Lorraine McFly appears to be a drunk and not really happy with her existence because she married this guy who she felt sorry for because he was on top of a tree and, you know, doing his thing with his binoculars looking at her through her bedroom window. So those are the characters, and then you got Mark McClure playing the older brother of Marty's, because they have 3 children, and then you got Wendy Jo Spurber, who is having problems meeting a guy, and she wears glasses, and so she looks like she is probably through her mother has been kept almost isolated from men. It seems to be the case. You know, why can't I ever meet anybody? And she says it will just happen. That's what Lorraine tells her. The older brother of Marty's, whose name doesn't come to mind immediately, so much for being a super Back to the Future fan, sorry, he works at McDonald's. So now, this is the current 1985 timeline of the first few minutes of the movie before Marty heads to 1955. Now, when he heads to 1955, of course, he changes history. So instead of George being hit by a car, which is why Lorraine then feels sorry for him and eventually marries him, Marty's hit by the car because he pushes his dad out of the way. He says, oh no, watch out, and not realizing what has just happened. Now, the parents would definitely have remembered Marty, who is known as Calvin, because that's the name he gives himself because of the Calvin Klein underwear, and then he says, well, my name is really Marty, but she keeps calling him Calvin. So there are a couple of other things that one could address as to why nobody would ever forget, particularly the parents, in 30 years, Marty, or this guy that basically told George McFly, if you put your mind to it, you can accomplish anything. Because George has interests in writing science fiction stories. So he never became a science fiction author in the 1985 that Marty came from. Think about this too. It's very likely that Calvin, Marty, had registered at the local high school, which he didn't have to, but he could have, so he could take classes. But I don't know if he ever is in class, but he appears at the cafeteria. Nobody kind of says, hey, what is this kid doing here, you know? There is that. then the fact that, of course, the advice he gives to George McFly, they become friends. He gets George also to defend himself against Biff, who's the main bully of the story, played, of course, by Thomas F. Wilson. And Lorraine McFly sees a real man when George punches Biff, which he never would have done in the alternate 1985 timeline. So already history is being changed. Marty has the photograph. One thing I would have loved in this film, you know, when you think back on it 35 years later, and I've seen Back to the Future many times, I saw it 4 times in theaters in 1985, is that when he's holding the photograph that he has, and it's himself and Mark McClure and Wendy Jo, his siblings, they start to disappear, and so does he. It would have been interesting if, because of all that's happened, that suddenly those siblings wouldn't exist anymore. Because it's possible. Also, there's no real... the truth is that maybe even Marty still wouldn't exist anyway. Because things change. When you change so much of somebody's present timeline, that is to say in 1955 when he's there, you change the whole course of their lives. I mean, who's to say that he would have even stuck around with Lorraine? Maybe George McFly would have gone with somebody else. Now that would have set the film on a whole different tailspin, so to speak, and really addressed the ideas of when time travel has, when there's a morality involved, and an ethical dilemma, because you don't know for sure. He starts disappearing in the photographs, and until they kiss, then that's what's needed, which is interesting. That a kiss seals the moment, and then Marty returns in a photograph of the siblings. Okay, so now, leaving that aside, they're still going to remember him because Lorraine was infatuated with this kid, and she chooses him over George, until George shows he's a man, and then everything changes, which, again, I'm sure some people would consider that a sexist thing, like, how can a teenage girl suddenly change sides that quickly, when she really adored this Calvin Marty guy, not knowing, of course, that's her future son. But they're going to remember him because of the band that plays, which is, oh my God, I completely forgot now. Chuck... Oh, jeez. Marvin Berry. Chuck Berry's cousin. They say, you know, play the guitar, and he does, because the other guy sliced his hand. So they need a guitarist. So he goes up on the stage, it's the prom and all this stuff. Or a dance. I think it was just a dance, I don't think it was the prom. And Marty starts playing the guitar, and then he says, play something that really cooks, says Marvin Berry. And so, of course, he plays Johnny B. Good, and it becomes a whole heavy metal thing, which is way beyond what anybody even anticipated in 1955. So, in a sense, he almost invented rock and roll, or perhaps, if you like, heavy metal. And he also invented the skateboard, because those two kids, when they see him go, wow, look at him go, he takes what looks like a wooden cart that these kids have, and they're kind of using it to ride along, and he removes the wooden partition, and he goes off, and whoa, look at him go. Of course they're going to remember that. Lorraine remembers that. Look at him, that's Calvin, he's a dreamboat, blah, blah, blah. George is going to remember him. So 30 years later, they're not going to forget this guy. Biff certainly is not going to forget him. That's very important, because he certainly wanted to kill this guy. Because of the damage to Biff's car. So, when you think of all that, of course they're going to remember him. The parents are going to remember him. The novelization for Back to the Future, I did read. And it was interesting, it sort of brought it all back. Now again, it's a novelization, but it's still interesting. In the novelization, and you know, novelizations of movies always have stuff that is not in the movies. They add a little wrinkle or two to something. Like, for example, with the Raiders of the Lost Ark novelization, which I did read back then, the moment when Indiana Jones is ready to take the fertility idol from that temple, the Incan temple, before he does it, he has like a little bottle of whiskey, and he, drinks a little, still studying that, doing his thing. Something that, of course, is not in the movie. But leaving that aside, novelizations always have things. In the novelization for Back to the Future, when Marty returns to 1985, and it's a different 1985, Lorraine, he asks his mother, Lorraine, he says, do you remember a guy named Marty or Calvin or something to that degree? I'm paraphrasing, of course. He says, I don't remember ever telling you about him. Yeah, I've thought about him. I think she says something like that. I wish I had novelization with me, but I don't have it anymore. But I don't remember ever telling you about him. So, in the novelization, they remember him. And now, Lorraine, her last words to him as the 1955 teenage Lorraine, when Marty takes off, because he has to head back to 1985, is Marty, what a nice name. And George says to him, thank you for all your advice, I'll never forget it. So they're always going to remember him, is my point. But there's a deeper issue with Back to the Future that was, believe it or not, pre-social media. I remember reading this. So I used to collect Starlog magazines, and I always liked reading the comments, which were always in the back of the magazine. And also Cine Fantastique, which was a great magazine. Both of them are actually not around anymore, which is unfortunate. They also had great comments at the end, last couple of pages of the magazine. But in that one, it was addressed something that always occurred to me about Back to the Future, which was that doesn't Marty miss the parents of the 1985 that we see in the beginning of the movie? And that's the real question. Because they're no longer the same people. So, now, moving the story forward, when he enters the new 1985, George McFly is an established science fiction author. He made it as an author. He doesn't work for Biff. Biff does auto detailing, and especially on George's car, and or waxing for the most part, and all that stuff. So in a sense, Biff is like working for George. So it's just the reverse. But George is an established science fiction author because he gets the book in the mail. He says, here it is. Biff picks it up. Your first novel. So he made it. And then he says, it's like I always say, you put your mind to it, you can accomplish anything. Which of course is the advice Marty from 1955 gave George. But it's never acknowledged at the end. But it doesn't make it a plot hole, because his name is still Marty McFly, and it continues to be in the alternate 1985, but the parents are totally different people. Mark McClure, the older brother, is now, looks like he works at the office. He's dressed in a suit. The house looks uniquely different. It's a little more polished. And his sister, I think, works at the bank. I'm not sure. But she looks like she has her head together, and it's not even wearing glasses. She doesn't look nerdy. She probably is dating somebody. That's what you could take away from there. And Biff, of course, is more of the weakling than anything else because of what George did. Now, Doc is still the same person, because now he has future knowledge of a time-traveling DeLorean that, of course, he invents and thinks of earlier that day in 1955 when Marty had returned. So now this Doc is aware of it. But what happens to that other alternate timeline? And the thing is that perhaps they fuse, or maybe they still exist separately. One of the curious things that Roger Ebert once brought up about Back to the Future Part 2 was that when Doc Brown says, we have to go back to 1955, again, because of what's happened in this current 1985 climate. We got to fix. But how do they know that when they go back to 1955 and then return back to 1985? This gets so confusing. How do they know it's going to be the same timeline? And that's a good question. Because even if you change the events, what if something happens? It's usually about making different decisions and learning from your past mistakes, or learning that you could make future mistakes, but that the future you make is your own. So that's really what I take away from the Back to the Future series. But let's be clear, there's a lot of things in them that there are a lot of big questions to ask. And that's what I love about time travel in general. I don't think Back to the Future takes time travel seriously. I think it's more of a comedy than anything else, for the most part. Although the second film is a lot darker. But nonetheless, one can ask, well, the real plot hole of Back to the Future is not so much whether the parents acknowledge the existence of Marty. They do, because of the dialogue that George gives to Marty that returns in the alternate 1985. Clearly that advice that he had given him 30 years earlier, he followed through on. It's not that, it's what does Marty really think of the fact that his parents are different now? Is he really happy with that? Because the parents he loved were the ones we saw in the opening, and they're totally different people now. They're not the same people. Which means, too, when you get right down to it, that Marty hasn't really made the same memories of his childhood onwards. They could be considerably different. So even though we see two Martys at the climax of Back to the Future, when he decides to return 10 minutes earlier, and he goes to Lone Pine Mall, which was originally Twin Pines Mall, he sees the other Marty, but that Marty doesn't know about what's going to happen now, so he's going to go back to 1955 too. I mean, this thing is like, you start thinking about it, and it's a continuous, several different circles here. They don't all come together beautifully, because you start asking a lot of questions. I guess my point is that the Marty that goes back again to 1955 that we see in the climax of Back to the Future, when Marty sees himself taking off on the DeLorean, did he have the same experiences as a Marty of the first 1985 at the beginning of the movie? The same childhood memories, the same memories of his parents, etc., etc. It's a good question. There are lots of questions you can ask. But anyway, I know it went on for a bit here, but I love Back to the Future, and I would love to hear what any of you have to say about it. I guess I could just leave it at this. If you still enjoy the movie, it's a fantastic movie, but it leaves you with some questions when you think about it a little more deeply. And I think the real plot hole, even though I don't really consider it as such, is what does Marty really think of this? Because it's never addressed in the other two movies that follow, that his parents have changed. So it brings up a lot of questions and a lot of alternate timelines. And, you start to wonder if anything is really going to be, it's crazy. I'll leave it at that. What do you guys think of Back to the Future? Do you think that what I suggested, which is not a plot hole, but the other bit about Marty not maybe giving much thought to the parents that he once had, the way they used to be, is a plot hole, or what? Or is it just that it's just one of those things you have to accept? And I do, but it always leaves me wondering, what did Marty think? It's not a plot hole, but it's something to ponder for sure. So let me know, you guys, what you think of Back to the Future, and anything having to do with Chris Pratt said. Just Back to the Future in general, your memories of Back to the Future, what you took away from it, and the time travel complications and paradoxes and alternate timelines and so on and so forth. You could go back and forth in this movie. I'm telling you, there's a lot of things I've thought about for years. So, what do you guys think really, what did Marty ever really have the chance to really think about the parents that he once had, and the siblings the way they once were, and now they're all different people? Even though they're still his siblings and they're still his parents, their personalities, the way they carry themselves is completely different. So they're not technically the same people in that sense. It's interesting to ponder. And that's all I got to say for now. And let me know what you think. Please subscribe to my channel. I have lots of movie reviews here. By the way, one side note, I want to thank the few people that commented on my Natalie Wood video. Thank you very much. positive or negative, I'm good with any types of comments, but in particular it was nice to read some thoughtful comments about the video. So hope to see more, and lend me your thoughts on Back to the Future, the paradoxes, the dilemmas. God, we could talk about the second film too next time. I mean, if any of you are really interested, I could tell you some ideas I have about that second picture. And then, to some degree, the third film, although I think that has less complications than even the first two films, but it brings up questions. But that second film, whoa, paradox heaven, or it gives you just a migraine to think about. And please subscribe to my channel. Lend me your thoughts. Please subscribe. Please hit like. I'd love to hear what people have to say out there. And this is Jerry Saravia at the Movies, signing off.